I'm the children's director here at Community Covenant Church. The first thing I'd like to say is I want to recognize this morning that this is a diverse body. And the body of Christ has many opinions and views that have been personally and profoundly worked out. So there are people in this room who represent all sorts of parties, all sorts of ideas, and all sorts of concepts about what we should do about voting and all that. I want to start by just recognizing that from the get-go. Now that I've made you sufficiently nervous about where I'm going to go, let's pray, and then we'll begin. O come, Emmanuel. We recognize, Jesus, that this has been a hard election cycle. We recognize as well that to complicate things, we also have things happening in our lives which are complicated. Recognize that there's people in here struggling with what is happening in our politics, but there's people in here struggling with what's happening personally in our own families. And in all of that, we are yearning for you. We are waiting for you. We know that you have accomplished our salvation on the cross, and you have risen, yet we continue to wait for your kingdom back. And help us always pray with yearning as Christians for thousands of years have done before us, God. We yearn for you. We wait. Amen. Recently, I had the wonderful opportunity to get away from all the political noise. For those of you who've been here for a while, you might know Mike Tuttle and Jeff Hammers. Well, they invited me to go backpacking. I'm from Mexico City, so I don't have any experience backpacking. So we traveled, I think, around 16 miles. I'm supposed to say 26. It was more like 16 miles. We went up into this really high country, like 20,000 feet. Actually, it's probably more like 10,000 feet. And it was really nice. And before we went, they told me that this was going to be a fishing trip, and we were going to take fishing poles. We were going to get to go fishing. It would be the first time I go fishing, and since Mike Tuttle is today not here because he's camping, and Jeff Hammers is teaching 5th and 6th this morning, I can say this to you, hoping that you'll keep it here. I can't stand fish. So before we went, I was very nervous because I'd have to learn how to fish. I'd have to learn how to do whatever it is you do after you do with the fish, and it's violent. If you've ever gutted a fish, it's pretty horrifying. And then I'd have to eat it as well. And it was great, though. Jeff was a wonderful teacher. He taught me like a father would teach a son. It was incredible. It was great to just be in this high, beautiful country where we could talk about other things other than politics and stuff like that. Although we did sometimes talk about politics, and we came to the same decision that probably many of you have come in your conversations week to week, which is, this is complicated. This is really hard. We also jokingly started talking about what would happen when we got back. When you're up backpacking, you're far away from everything, and you don't have any way of communicating, and so you start wondering, I wonder if my daughter Kelby is behaving this week, or if California is still going to be there when we get back. You start wondering different things like that. You're not really sure. I love God, and I trust God. Yet I still have quite a bit of anxiety. I'm a pretty anxious, nervous person. If you talk to pastoral staff, they'll tell you that is true. Which is why so many people, I think, volunteer for children's ministries. They're like, we got to help this guy out. So let's do whatever we can. And so what I did was I spent a lot of time poring over different opinion articles and what different Christians believed, and just reading and trying to figure out what the right answer is for anything that we're voting about. Anything. I just wanted to read. And I kept kind of yearning for Jesus to be there, and for Jesus to just tell me. Just tell me what I'm supposed to do. So I started to think about the disciples, and I thought maybe back in the day when Jesus was there, it was a lot easier for the disciples because he was right there. He was making all the calls. I'm sure it would be easier for them, right? Well, no. Yeah, no. In fact, if you read the Gospel of Matthew, halfway through the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus began to move his disciples towards Jerusalem, the political and religious center of the land. And along the way, he started saying some really upsetting things about dying, about being betrayed. They started saying some kind of weird things about rising from the dead and a coming kingdom. His miracles were starting to get more and more interesting as well. And not only that, but the closer and closer they got to Jerusalem, more and more people were getting upset. And there was hostility and aggression towards Jesus and his ragtag band of disciples. And he had a ragtag band of disciples, right? They represented all sorts of political views. We think it's complicated in this room. Imagine the 12. There was a tax collector for the Roman Empire. He was Jewish, so he was betraying his nation. And there was a zealot who may have been interested in violently overthrowing the Roman government. Coexisting and following Jesus together. That's complicated. More complicated, I think, than my typical week stressing about Facebook. Which I do. Like I said, I'm a nervous guy. The disciples were powder keg for sure, and as Jesus' ministry became more and more intense, you have to wonder what they were starting to think. Were they starting to weigh their options, trying to figure out how to get out? Were they starting to figure out if they're, collecting swords and getting ready to fight? What was Jesus going to do? How far was he willing to go? And in that move, we have this funny, weird little story about a coin and a fish. And I'd like to read it this morning with you. So turn your Bibles to Matthew 17, 24 to 27. In your life group homework, I actually have you start from 22. And I want to highlight that 23 says, "And they were greatly distressed." When they reached Capernaum, the collectors of the temple tax came to Peter and said, "Does your teacher not pay the temple tax?" He said, "Oh, yes, he does." And when he came home, Jesus spoke of it first, asking, "Well, what do you think, Simon? From whom do kings of the earth take toll or tribute? From their children or from others?" When Peter said, "Well, from others," Jesus said to him, "Then the children are free. However, so that we do not give offense to them, go to the sea and cast a hook. Take the first fish that comes up, and when you open its mouth, you will find a coin. Take that and give it to them for you and for me." Amen. So to reiterate, by this point, the disciples are greatly distressed. And Peter, if you know anything about Peter's story, he's a fisherman, and I resonate with him because he's kind of a nervous and anxious guy as well. He was so appalled by the idea of Jesus being betrayed and dying that at one point he confronted Jesus and said, No, not you, Lord. And Jesus promptly called him, you remember, Satan. But Peter, that didn't stop Peter. He was still determined to save his teacher. He was more and more on guard. Later, when people came to arrest Jesus, it would be Peter who would pull out a sword and he'd cut off another man's ear. That's what he was going to do. And soon enough, Peter finds trouble in this very story, and he's confronted by the collectors of the temple tax. He quickly tries to dodge the bullet and says, "Yes, we paid it, we're good. No worries here, we're good. These are not the droids you're looking for. Carry on." But as we keep reading this story, it becomes pretty clear that either Peter is lying, or he's being somewhat naively mistaken about what's happening, right? Because Jesus immediately clarifies that he is not intending on paying the temple tax, even though Peter just said he does. Now, in and of itself, the temple tax is actually not that big a deal. It was not huge. It only amounted to 2 days' worth of wages, and you only had to pay it once a year. It wasn't a foreign tax imposed by the Roman government. It came from Jewish religious norms. It was annoying, possibly, to some, but it wasn't necessarily criminal. The tax was also for a good cause. It went to the temple, a place where Jews worshiped and sacrificed. It was a good place for money to go to. But also, the temple tax was not that enforced. It was kind of a loose tax. In fact, you could opt out of it for many reasons. Plenty of religious groups opted and decided not to pay the temple tax. You could also be exempt if you were living off charity. You could also be exempt if you were a teacher or a rabbi. Jesus is a teacher. He's a rabbi. He is exempt. Not only that, but Jesus and Peter are living, at this point, off of gifts from the women in their group. They're living off charity. So, In theory, theoretically, to avoid the problem, all Peter had to do was say, okay, look, I don't like all this running around and stuff, but I'm just going to go down, talk to the tax guys, tell them that I'm going to fill out Form 1085B, and then we'll be good. No problem. We'll be good. Everything's going to be fine. But Jesus, who I keep thinking if he was right here, he'd make my life a lot simpler. Jesus is unpredictable, and you can't really tell him what to do. He doesn't appeal to his rights as a rabbi. He doesn't appeal to his right as somebody who is living off of charity. Instead, Jesus appeals to a kind of weird status as a child of God. He basically says, and he'll say this before in Matthew, he'll say it later, this is my dad's house. I don't have to pay rent. Can you imagine your children saying that to you? Well, yes, maybe. I don't make Kelly pay rent, by the way. Can you imagine what Peter was thinking then when Jesus said, we'll go back, actually, I'm a child of God, we don't have to pay this tax. He's probably saying, okay, hold on, wait a second. You want me to go and tell them that you're not going to pay the tax because you're the Son of God? Becomes infinitely more complicated, doesn't it? For Peter, this was a whole new level of crazy. It's one thing to get a tax break because you have a dependent. It's another thing to get out of taxes because, well, I'm God. And Peter has reason to be worried. See, I don't really have the reasons Peter does to be anxious and nervous and afraid. Peter has legitimate reasons. And we need to remember that when we read Peter's story, when we read about this context. The reality is that for Peter and Jesus, where they're living is a lot more dangerous than we're experiencing or we've ever experienced, right? It's a lot more dangerous. And the decisions they make are very dangerous. Just consider, for example, the opening chapters of Matthew. Jesus arrives as a baby, and there's this crazy king who gets wind of it. He finds this tiny, small town where Jesus may have been born, and he massacres the babies. Just a couple chapters before this whole conversation happens, Jesus' cousin, John, has been beheaded at a party. He was put in jail because he said some uncomfortable things about the king. We need to remember that at the end, Jesus and all the disciples, most of the disciples, will die because of what they believe in. Even Peter. If we're honest, our experience of religious persecution is in the U.S. not really. In fact, I hesitate to even use the word persecution. Fortunately, it's very lacking. The disciples were very aware every day of the dangers they faced for following Jesus. In fact, not only the disciples, but the people who would first read this gospel were very aware. When Matthew was putting this gospel together, now, you may not know this, but the different gospel writers were thinking of people when they collected the stories of Jesus. And Matthew was no exception. And he was thinking of people, and he was putting together this gospel, and he's the only one that includes a story in it. He knew, as he was collecting these stories, that he was writing for a church full of people who knew that following Jesus was scandalous, at the least, deadly, at the most. In fact, by the time the Gospel of Matthew is actually getting passed around and people are reading it, there is no more temple. By that time, the Jewish Christians who are now living around the Roman Empire, there is no such thing as a temple. The temple has been destroyed by Roman forces. Jerusalem has been ransacked. Thousands of people have been killed and exiled. The first churches were made up of people like Peter, followers of Jesus who were all too aware, all too painfully aware, that the empire they lived in demanded strict allegiance. So I want to remind us that as we dig into the Bible stories, we have to try and regain an understanding of what it was like to read about Jesus as one who was persecuted and afraid every day. Let's remember that the Bible is mostly about nomads. It's mostly about slaves. It's mostly about exiles. There's one minor moment in the Old Testament, King Solomon, when things were going really well. But it seems almost like a blip. The rest of the Bible talks about people living in exile, yearning for God to come. Oh, come, Emmanuel. I got to be honest, as an educated, and I'm going through seminary, so I think my Bible props are pretty high up there. And I've been educated and pretty well. I would not be surprised if a Syrian refugee opened a Bible for the first time and understood these stories so much deeper than I do. The truth is, Peter has plenty of reasons to be concerned. Because what Jesus is suggesting is really, really dangerous. To his relief, though, he and Jesus agree on at least one thing, right? Let's not cause any more trouble than we need to, and let's not offend them. Now, me reading this story, I want to say something to you about how we're a diverse body, and we need to stop yelling at each other on Facebook and blowing up over every little thing. We actually need to be more patient and loving. But this is actually not about that. What it's really about is about Jesus once again demonstrating that he cares about others, even those who would oppose him. He cares about them so much, he is willing to give up his own God-given rights to demonstrate that care. And Jesus will do this all the way to the cross. Every time I get wrapped up in a Facebook argument, I have to wonder, why am I so obsessed with being right? Am I willing to give up my right to be right? Jesus' love then becomes even more evident and profound in one of the weirdest and most unique miracles of the Bible. A miracle that has a bonus attached to it. Here, Peter is told to go fish a fish, and inside the fish, he will find the exact amount to pay the temple tax. So there's two things we need to draw from this. The first one is, if there's any question about whether or not Jesus is a child of God, that is resolved in miracles like these. Jesus owns the fish, he owns the money, and therefore owns the governments and empires that own the money as well. Jesus is undoubtedly a child of the king. But there's another part to this, and this is really good for Peter. There is enough money in that fish, not just for Jesus, but also for Peter. It is incredibly one of the weirdest love letters ever written, in which Jesus emphatically tells Peter, I love you, welcome to the family, I got this. We are children of God. And this miracle, like every one of Jesus' miracles, is about reminding us who our King is. There is no government, no political party, no candidate that will ever provide for us the way that Jesus does. And part of the difficulty with reading about Jesus in our current context is that we honestly live in an age of unprecedented religious freedom and privilege. The first people who read the story in the Gospel of Matthew did not have nearly as much freedom. Every day they were well aware that there's only one good option, and that's Jesus. Quite simple, yet incredibly profound. We have to regain those lenses. We are children of God, followers of Jesus, but we're living in exile, and we're waiting for kingdom come. This is a normal yearning of this in-between. And this exile, it can be hard, it can be scary, it can be volatile, you can be tired and frustrated, you name it. But it is especially frustrating and heart-wrenching if we sell our souls to the wrong parents. All other parents will disappoint us. We are not children of our nation, our kings, our political candidates, or leaders. We are children of God. And not just any God, but a God who listens, who's active, and whose desire is that none of his children be lost. When Jesus commands us not to worry, he appeals to us to remember what it's like for a parent to take care of their child. So now I want to invite us to the table this morning. We are a community of turncoat tax collectors and zealots living and worshiping together in this room. Imagine how incredible it is for people to see us loving each other and worshiping each other, even when we vehemently disagree with each other. Sorry, not worshiping each other, worshiping God. That's a big mistake. Worshiping God. Imagine what it would be like if everybody knew that instantly. So with great hope and expectation to a Jesus who says, I love you, welcome to the family, I got you covered. Let's come to the table.